Okay, so what if a really fundamental idea, one you've probably just accepted your whole life, the idea that you have just one single mind, right? One voice inside calling the shots. What if that whole idea was actually maybe holding you back?
Hmm.
What if you are, in fact, inherently multiple? Not in a disordered way, but in a way that's totally natural, functional, maybe even powerful.
That really flies in the face of how we usually think, doesn't it? We're
Yeah.
so culturally conditioned to see ourselves as this single, consistent I.
Absolutely. And kind of unpacking that conditioning is exactly what this deep dive is about today. We're digging into a really fascinating source text that you shared with us, one that offers a pretty radically different way of seeing ourselves.
Yeah, this text explores something called internal family systems, or IFS. And it suggests our inner world isn't like a simple monologue. It's more like a busy, complex system full of interacting subpersonalities, or what IFS calls parts.
Right. So our goal here, our mission for this deep dive is to sort of guide you through that shift in perspective, moving away from that mono-mind belief, as the text calls it, and towards seeing yourself as this, well, dynamic internal system.
And maybe more importantly, figuring out what that actually means for understanding your own internal conflicts, those really challenging emotions we all have, and maybe living with a bit more freedom.
So where do we start? The text kicks off by describing what it calls the mono-mind belief system.
Yeah,
It's that bedrock assumption, right? That all our thoughts, feelings, urges, they all come from one single place. You. Your one mind.
yeah, it feels really intuitive. I mean, it feels like I am thinking this or I am feeling angry. But IFS offers this counter idea, multiplicity, the idea that we're actually born with many distinct subminds or parts, fundamentally.
And according to this view, what we just experience as, thinking or feeling is actually these parts interacting, sometimes talking to each other inside us.
Exactly. Think about a time you were wrestling with a tough decision.
Hmm.
Part of you pulling one way, another part pulling the other way. That internal debate, IFS would say that's not just abstract thought. It's your parts, literally in conversation.
And usually under the old mono-mind view, we just label that I'm conflicted and kind of leave it there.
Mm-hmm.
But IFS says, hang on, let's actually look at the different players involved in that inner discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the source text makes a really, well, a striking claim here. It's worth pausing on this because it might be controversial for some listeners. It states, and this is according to this text, that what IFS calls parts and what gets called alters in dissociative identity disorder, or DIID,
Yeah.
they're presented as basically the same underlying phenomenon.
It's a big assertion.
Yeah.
The difference, as this source describes it, isn't whether we have multiple parts, it says we all do, but the degree of fragmentation. So with DID, severe trauma, especially early on, causes the system to fragment much more drastically. Those parts become really polarized, really disconnected from each other.
But the text is really clear. The fundamental existence of these subminds is presented as natural for everyone, not inherently pathological.
Which is a huge reframing. Because, as the source points out, our cultural mono-mind view has actually led us to pathologize this natural multiplicity. If you should be one unified thing,
Right.
then any inner voice or impulse that feels separate or maybe uncontrollable or just different, it gets slapped with a label. Disordered, damaged, evidence that you're broken off from some assumed healthy single state.
So what happens when we live our lives based on that mono-mind idea? What are the consequences?
Well, the source argues they're pretty significant and often quite negative.
Yeah.
If you believe you've got one mind that's just somehow flawed or broken, what's your main strategy for dealing with disturbing thoughts or feelings?
Control, right. You try to fight them, ignore them, discipline them into submission, hide them, or just feel deep shame for even having them.
Yeah, shame about lacking willpower.
Exactly. The text uses the example of trying to override fear with rational thought, just thinking your way out of it.
Which rarely works perfectly.
Right. So when the fear hangs around, you might escalate. You start criticizing yourself. Why am I so scared? This is stupid. Maybe try to numb it out somehow, or turn to meditation or something specifically to transcend it or get rid of it.
And if those things don't work, the mono-mind view often leads you to just adapt your life around the feeling. Okay, I won't do public speaking anymore because of fear wins. Then you feel like a failure and that little voice pops up. What's fundamentally wrong with me?
The text also touches on how getting a traditional diagnosis within this one troubled mind framework can sometimes just reinforce that feeling of being defective. It can lower self-esteem, increase shame.
Leading people to hide what they see as flaws, maybe pull back from relationships.
Yeah, there's a quote in the source from Jonathan Van Ness that really hits this home. Something like, "Would you still be so excited to meet me if you really knew who I was? If you knew all the things I have done? If you could see all my parts?"
Wow. Yeah, that captures that deep fear, doesn't it? If people saw the inner complexity, the parts we struggle with, they'd reject us.
It really does. So it makes you wonder, where did this powerful mono-mind idea and this intense focus on self-control, where did it even come from?
The source actually traces some historical roots, pointing to influential ideas that kind of set the stage for seeing our more primal instincts negatively.
Like some specific Christian influences, for example. The text mentions John Calvin's doctrine of total depravity, this idea that human nature is utterly devoid of goodness and full of evil, or the Catholic concept of original sin.
These ideas shaped a view where the whole person could be seen as inherently flawed, right down to the core.
And it wasn't just religion, was it?
No, the source also points to philosophical and political ideas. It mentions what's sometimes called the veneer theory thinkers, like Thucydides, Machiavelli, Hobbes, suggesting that underneath a thin layer of civilization, we're all just selfish, aggressive impulses waiting to break out.
Even Freud's drive theory gets a mention as contributing to a somewhat pessimistic view of our basic nature.
So this idea that our inner world is kind of suspect and needs strict management, it's woven pretty deep into Western thought.
And that emphasis on willpower, self-control. The source connects it partly to the Victorian era, that Christian focus on resisting evil impulses. Self-discipline becomes this huge virtue. Taking personal responsibility is key, and lacking control is seen almost as a moral failing.
hmm And the source offers a critique here, noting how this willpower ethic can sometimes be misused. Even it suggests to justify social inequalities the idea that maybe the poor just lack self-control while the rich have it mastered.
Which the text contrasts with research suggesting that meeting basic needs actually boosts productivity, not some inherent willpower difference. It also makes the point that constant economic instability keeps our survival-focused parts really activated.
It's a heavy cultural load we carry. And the internal result, we often learn really young to shame and kind of manhandle the parts of us that don't fit the ideal, wrestle them into submission.
Often by recruiting another part to do the job, right? Like an inner critic or a really harsh drill sergeant part.
Exactly. Which brings us to the core problem with that whole approach. Why doesn't fighting or shaming these inner parts actually work?
The source is pretty blunt about it. The harder we try to get rid of emotions and thoughts, the stronger they become. It's like parts, just like people, tend to push back when they're shamed or ignored or exiled.
That inner drill sergeant might seem effective for enforcing discipline, but the text argues that dominating parts with punishment and rigidity leads to a life that might be controlled, but maybe isn't very flexible or joyful. You might be disciplined, but, as it says, not much fun.
And you live with this underlying fear that those parts you've pushed away, the ones carrying urges to binge or rage or whatever, might just burst out if you ever let your guard down.
The source does mention that some 12-step approaches offer a different path here, suggesting that surrendering that need for control to a higher power can help release the grip of that inner drill sergeant.
But the IFS alternative presented here is distinct. Instead of discipline coming from that harsh inner critic, it comes from a different internal place, something the source calls the self.
And this self says no to impulsive parts, but it does it firmly, but from a place of love and patience, like an ideal parent, maybe.
Exactly. And crucially, in IFS, when parts do take over or cause trouble, the response isn't to shame them or fight them, it's curiosity.
Curiosity.
Wait, right.
You use that strong feeling or impulse or thought as a kind of trailhead, a starting point to get curious about what's driving it. What's the story behind this part? What does it actually need to heal?
This completely shifts the frame, doesn't it? Away from seeing parts as just obstacles you have to defeat. The source actually critiques many traditional therapies and even some spiritual practices for unintentionally reinforcing the monomind view.
How so?
By treating thoughts, emotions, or what's often just lumped together as the ego as hindrances, things that need to be corrected or transcended or meditated away.
Okay. The text gives examples, like some Hindu traditions viewing the ego as working for Maya illusion, the temptress keeping us trapped, or the common Buddhist monkey mind metaphor. While helpful for noticing busy thoughts, the source suggests it can sometimes lead us to see thoughts as just irritating nuisances or primitive garbage to be dismissed.
Yeah, it mentions Ralph de la Rosa's critique about how trying to get rid of thoughts can actually be counterproductive. And the source text itself has this really provocative line, something like, if we look carefully, the ego is likely those very voices that are yelling at us to get rid of it.
Wow. So the parts trying to control are labeling other parts as the problem ego.
That's the idea presented. From the IFS perspective laid out here, what often gets called the ego is actually a collection of these protector parts. They're working incredibly hard trying to keep us safe, often by managing or containing other more vulnerable parts, the exiles, the ones carrying pain and trauma memories.
The source also brings up spiritual bypassing here.
Right, that term for using spiritual ideas or practices to avoid dealing with emotional pain, confusing self-avoidance with enlightenment. Jeff Brown's work is mentioned in that context.
And even the classic story of the Buddhist path to enlightenment.
Yeah.
The source suggests maybe we can view it through a different lens than just ignoring or resisting thoughts. Maybe those figures he encountered represented internal parts too.
It's an interesting thought. Mindfulness practices, obviously derived from Buddhism, are acknowledged in the text. They're seen as a really good first step, observing thoughts and feelings with acceptance, not fighting them.
But there's a but.
Yeah, there's a but. The source also points out that even experienced meditators sometimes report really disturbing episodes during practice. Intense fear, anxiety, paranoia, sometimes even reliving trauma.
Under the mono-mind view, those might just be seen as temporary obstacles, glitches in concentration.
Exactly. But IFS offers a different take. These aren't just thoughts. They're described as hurting parts, or exiles, emerging when the protector parts, the ones usually keeping those feelings locked down, finally relax a bit in meditation.
And these parts don't just bring thoughts, they bring intense emotions, beliefs, memories, what IFS calls burdens.
And the key difference is the mono-mind view doesn't see these as distinct entities, these parts, that you can actually listen to and help.
Which leads us neatly into the origin story of IFS itself, doesn't it? And this crucial discovery the author made about what these parts are really like.
Yeah, the author, Richard Schwartz, started out as a family therapist, focusing on the external family system, thinking if you fix the outside dynamics, the inside stuff will sort itself out.
But it wasn't quite working, especially with his bulimic clients, right? They'd make progress in therapy, understand things, but the binging and purging cycles continued.
So he pressed them, like what's happening inside when that urge takes over, and they started describing these internal parts that felt like they had minds of their own, parts that made them do things they consciously didn't want to do.
Which initially kind of freaked him out, according to the text. He wondered if he was dealing with DD.
But then he got curious about his own inner world, and he was genuinely shocked, he says, to find he had parts too. Some felt pretty extreme to him.
So instead of pathologizing it, he leaned in. Started asking clients to describe these parts. What do they feel like? What do they do? How do they interact? Did they fight, team up, protect each other? He saw this clear inner system mirroring the external families he knew.
And boom, internal family systems.
He uses the bulimia example to show these dynamics. Like, an inner critic part attacks the person,
Making them feel worthless, which triggers maybe a binging part to numb out.
which then brings the critic back even stronger. A vicious cycle driven by these interacting parts.
And at first, following the standard thinking, he tried helping clients fight these parts. Told them to ignore the critic, argue with it.
Which, as the source notes, just made things worse. The parts dug in their heels, they didn't like being dismissed or fought.
Then came this breakthrough moment, this anecdote in the text. A client whose part was making her cut her wrists. He tried everything he knew as a therapist to stop it and failed completely. He felt totally defeated.
And in that moment of just exhaustion and giving up, he apparently just said something like, I give up, I can't beat you at this.
And the part responded. It said something like, I don't really want to beat you.
Whoa!
Yeah, that was the pivot, moving out of trying to control and into just genuine curiosity. He could then ask the part, why? Why do you do this to her?
And the part explained its history. How it needed to get the client out of her body during severe childhood abuse. How it was trying to control this immense rage that felt dangerous. It was basically stuck in the past, still operating as if that danger was immediate years later.
And this experience, and many others like it, led to this core revelation. Parts are rarely what they seem on the surface. like kids forced into roles in troubled families. Internal parts often take on extreme, even destructive roles because they honestly believe it's necessary to protect the person, to protect the whole system.
And they're often frozen in time, carrying the pain and fear of old wounds.
So the whole therapeutic approach shifted. It wasn't about fighting parts anymore. It was about helping clients listen to them.
And consistently, the parts told similar stories.
Right.
I took on this job back then to protect us.
And the really amazing part described in the source is what happened when these protective parts felt truly heard. When asked, what would you rather be doing if you didn't have to do this extreme job anymore? Their answers were often the complete opposite of their current role.
Like critics wanting to be encouragers.
Yeah. Or hyper caretakers wanting to set boundaries. Rageful parts wanting to help discern true danger versus perceived danger.
So after decades of this work, the author came to this really foundational conclusion. There are no inherently bad parts. Even the ones that seem the most damaging have a positive intention, deep down. They're stuck, they're trying to protect, and they have valuable qualities waiting to emerge.
Which brings up another key idea in the text. What exactly are these parts carrying that makes them act so extremely? This is where the concept of burdens comes in.
Right. Burdens. They're described as these extreme beliefs and emotions, sometimes felt almost physically, like energies. The text uses descriptions like tar or a fireball or a heavyweight that parts carry on or in their bodies.
And it's these burdens that drive their extreme actions. It's a really crucial distinction the source makes. The burden isn't the same thing as the part itself. It's something the part is carrying.
Where do they come from? Well, direct experiences, especially early ones. Feelings of worthlessness from being abused, terror after an accident, the belief nobody can be trusted after a betrayal. These intense feelings and beliefs get lodged in young, vulnerable parts. The text connects this to attachment theory's internal working models, those core beliefs about self and others we form early on.
But it's not just personal experiences, is it? The source talks about legacy burdens.
Yeah, those are fascinating. Inherited from family, parents, culture, even maybe ethnic groups. Things we didn't experience directly but absorbed somehow. And they can be just as powerful, maybe even more so because they're often invisible to us. Like, as the text says, water to a fish. We're just swimming in them.
And the source points out what it calls a crucial error that many other ways of thinking make. Mistaking the burden for the part.
For example,
Like believing someone struggling with addiction is their addiction, that the urge to use defines them rather than seeing it as, say, a protective part carrying unbearable pain or fear and using the substance to cope.
I see. And if you make that error, you end up fighting the part itself, right? Trying to willpower it away.
Which often just makes the internal conflict worse. The IFS approach described here is totally different. You approach that drug-seeking part with curiosity. You see it as protective, trying its best, however misguidedly, to manage overwhelming burdens.
You honor its effort, even if the behavior is destructive.
You honor its intention to protect, yes. And you negotiate a path towards healing by helping the part unburden those extreme beliefs and emotions it's carrying.
And this unburdening process, the text describes it as almost spiritual sometimes.
It does. It says that as these burdens leave, the part literally release the parts immediately transform into their original valuable states, like a weight lifted or a curse broken.
And then they naturally find new, positive roles.
Exactly. The part that drove the addiction might transform and want to help build healthy connections. The hypervigilant part becomes a wise advisor about safety. The harsh critic becomes an inner cheerleader. The source sums it up. Each part is like a person with a true purpose.
Okay, but let's tackle the really tough one. How can we seriously say no bad parts when we think about truly horrific actions, like violence?
The source doesn't shy away from this. It draws directly from the author's work, some very challenging work.
Like his work with sex offenders in a place called Onarga Academy.
Yes. And the text shares this powerful recurring story that emerged from those men. During their own childhood trauma, often involving severe abuse, a protector part within them took on the actual rage, the violent energy, the desire to dominate of their own abuser. It was like a desperate last-ditch attempt to survive, to fight back somehow internally.
So these perpetrator parts were essentially frozen in that terrifying past moment, carrying the overwhelming burden of the abuser's hatred and their perverse need to dominate vulnerability.
That's how it's described. And molesting others, tragically, became a way to replicate that power dynamic, but this time putting them in the position of power over vulnerability instead of being the victim. The source suggests this is one way these terrible legacy burdens of violence get passed down generations.
But the text also describes healing.
Astonishingly, yes. As the parts that were stuck back in the original childhood abuse were healed and unburdened their pain, the perpetrator parts were then able to unload the burdens they carried, those toxic energies and intentions absorbed from the abusers, and they also transformed, becoming nonviolent, even valuable parts of the inner system.
That's profound.
It is, and it's why the author maintains, after decades of this incredibly difficult work, his conviction that there are no bad parts. He connects it back to the core message of compassion in many spiritual traditions, but argues IFS gives us a practical way to access that compassion by seeing the secret, painful history and the unbearable burdens driving even the most destructive actions. It offers hope.
So if parts aren't the problem and burdens can be released, what's the engine of healing? This must be where the self comes in.
Exactly. The discovery of what the source calls the self. The author apparently stumbled upon it using techniques adapted from Gestalt therapy, like asking clients to have parts step back internally for a moment.
And when parts step back,
Mm.
what happened?
He noticed clients would shift. Suddenly, they'd become noticeably, well, mindfully curious, calm, confident, present, compassionate towards themselves and even towards the parts they used to hate or fear.
And clients themselves describe this state
As more myself, or my core, or who I really am.
so the author gave it the name, the self.
Yep. And the key qualities described are pretty remarkable. It's present in everyone. It can't be damaged by trauma or life experience. It doesn't need to be developed or built. It's already there. And it has this inherent wisdom to heal the internal system and guide external relationships.
So it's not something you have to strive for. It's just there,
Yeah.
beneath the surface.
That's the core idea. It's presented as being just beneath the surface of our protective parts. And when those protectors feel safe enough to relax and open up some space, the self just emerges, spontaneously, often quite suddenly, and apparently universally across different people.
The source calls this discovery the most significant one in IFS, what changes everything.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground conceptually here. Moving from that standard idea of a single mind to this model of, well, multiplicity, burdened parts, and this core self. But IFS isn't just theory, right? It's very much a practice.
Absolutely. And the source includes some practical ways to start exploring your own inner world using these ideas.
Yeah, some exercises. One foundational one mentioned is called getting to know a protector. How does that work?
It starts simply kind of like mindfulness. You just notice a thought, feeling, sensation, maybe an impulse that's grabbing your attention. That's your trailhead.
Your starting point.
Exactly. Then you focus on it. Maybe notice where you feel it in or around your body. And here's a key step. Notice your attitude toward it. Are you annoyed by it, scared of it, already judging it?
If your attitude isn't open or curious,
That's a sign that other parts, maybe a critical part or an anxious part, are blended with your awareness. You're seeing the trailhead through them. So you gently ask those blended parts to just step back a little, give you some space.
and if you can get to that place of open curiosity, that presence that's accessing the self.
That's the idea.
Yeah.
From that clearer space, you can start to interact. You focus on where you sense the trailhead and you ask the feeling or impulse or part, what do you want me to know?
Yeah.
And then you just listen, wait for an answer without trying to figure it out logically.
And if you get something back, a feeling, an image, words,
You can continue the conversation. Maybe ask, what are you afraid would happen if you stopped doing this job? That helps uncover its protective intention. You can genuinely thank it for trying to help, even if its methods are causing problems.
Yeah.
And then maybe ask what it needs from you now.
The source stresses that the initial feeling is just the trailhead, right?
Yeah.
It leads you to the part itself, which is more complex. It has history, beliefs, a whole story.
Exactly. And that whole process of separating your self-awareness from the part so you can observe it and interact with curiosity, that's called unblending.
It feels like a really big shift, moving beyond just observing thoughts, like in some meditation, to actively turning toward these inner experiences and building a relationship with them, a curious, compassionate relationship.
Yeah, the idea is these parts have often been operating kind of alone, maybe without much adult supervision, so
Yeah.
to speak. They often really appreciate the attention, being seen and heard by the self.
There's another exercise described too, right? Mapping your parts.
Yes, using paper and pencil. You start with a trailhead for a part that feels active around a particular issue,
Mm-hmm.
located internally. Then draw something on the paper to represent it, shape, symbol, whatever feels right.
Okay.
Then, focusing on that part you just drew, you wait and see what next part or feeling emerges from it, or in relation to it. Where does that lead you inside? You find that next part, locate it, and draw it on the page, maybe showing how it connects to the first one.
And you keep going.
You repeat it following the internal connections until you feel like you've mapped out a little cluster, an internal clove or subsystem. Often, it's maybe 4 or 5 related parts that tend to work together around a specific issue.
The source uses that garlic analogy, right? Instead of an onion with one core, it's more like a head of garlic with multiple distinct cloves or subsystems.
Precisely. Mapping helps you see one of those cloves.
Mm.
And once you have a little map, you hold it back, look at it from a bit of a distance. How do these parts relate? Does one protect another? Do they fight? Team up? You just notice the relationship.
And you also notice how you feel looking at the map.
Yeah, usually if you're looking from a slight distance, you feel some curiosity, compassion, maybe clarity. That's a good sign you're accessing the self and looking at your internal landscape rather than being caught in it. The source suggests mapping really helps you unblend from the parts involved in an issue and gives you insights into why certain patterns play out in your life.
Wow. What a journey this perspective offers. Shifting from that really ingrained cultural idea of just one mind, which so often leads us to fight or shame our own inner experiences.
Yeah, shifting to understanding ourselves as naturally multiple, with
Mm.
this whole system of parts that, even when they act in ways that seem destructive, are fundamentally trying to protect us. They're carrying burdens from the past. They're not just inherently bad or broken.
And discovering that underneath all that, every single person has this undamaged core of presence, wisdom, self, which is capable of leading that inner system with compassion and clarity.
And the whole process isn't about getting rid of parts. It's about turning towards them
Hmm?
with curiosity, listening to their stories, helping them release those burdens, those extreme beliefs and pains, and letting them transform back into their naturally valuable states.
So, for you listening, how might this different way of looking at things change how you understand your own internal conflicts, those times you feel pulled in different directions, or those really tough emotions that feel overwhelming, maybe even behaviors you've just labeled self-sabotage?
And beyond that, how might it change how you see other people? Knowing that they too have these complex inner worlds full of protective parts carrying hidden histories and burdens.
And here's a final thought, building on what the source suggests. If our relationships with our inner parts really do mirror our relationships in the external world, what new possibilities might open up out there? For connection, for understanding, maybe even for healing. If we start approaching our own inner enemies and outcasts with the kind of love, curiosity, and acceptance this text suggests is possible.
Something definitely worth pondering as you navigate your own complex world, both inside and out.